Thinking about starting a church podcast? Well, you've come to the right podcast. We're talking about starting podcasts today on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball. I'm joined by my friend and podcast co-host, AJ Matthew.
Podcast Matthew.
AJ Podcast Matthew. Podcasts, all right. We're joking a little bit because it has become a bit of a meme almost in society that like everyone has a podcast now. And it does feel a little bit like we want to be self-aware. We know that we also have a podcast. So I think maybe the first question that we maybe need to address before we get into how to start one is should you start one in a really crowded space that is podcasting? Is there room for your church to start one? And my answer to that would be yes, if you have the right kind of goals. So that we're going to be talking about that more in depth later. But I think the answer is yes. If you've got the right frame of mind for this and the right motivations for it, I think it's a good idea to do it.
Yeah. I was never a podcast listener. Not really. I wouldn't call myself a fanatic even now. I love doing a podcast. I don't feel like I have a lot of time to listen. But podcast is kind of an interesting thing. It's almost like television. 30 years ago, we had a limited number of channels. People watched like live television. Like, hey, this is going to be on. I'm going to listen to it or watch it. And then radio is kind of the same thing. Like radio was radio. And now everybody's streaming stuff. Television has completely changed. Radio also has changed because there's satellite radio where you can dive into genres, and of course just streaming music where you pick out I only want to hear exactly what I want to hear. And that's where the podcast thing has fit in. Everybody's time is valuable and limited, and they're like, I want to hear something that's exactly what I want to hear when I want to hear it. So
yes.
You know what? Yeah, for that reason, sure, there's room for you.
Yeah, there's room for you. So just some interesting statistics to start us off before we get into the steps of starting a church podcast. And by the way, there's lots of great YouTube videos and other podcasts that are about starting a podcast. This is narrowly kind of focused on starting a podcast for your church. And so hopefully this can be supplemental to other things that you might find online that will be very highly technical. We're going to touch on some technical things, but if you really want like in-depth technical details on things, this is not the place for that. There's lots of good stuff on the internet for that. But some statistics you might find interesting. 62% of the US population over age 12 has listened to a podcast ever. And about 26%, AJ, listen to a podcast every week. So that's a lot of people. That's millions of people. I am one of those. I actually listen to podcasts every day. So I know you said every single day. Yeah. I have a handful that I listen to, and it's just when I'm driving. Like I don't make extra time to listen to them, but when I'm driving to go pick up my kids or when I'm mowing the yard or whatever, I've got a handful of podcasts that I listen to. So I listen to.
I guess I shouldn't be acting like I'm so shocked. I go to the gym with my son 3 days a week, and I'm on the treadmill 30 minutes each time. So for 90 minutes a week, I'm listening to podcasts. So I'm in the 26% of listening every week. I only subscribe to like 3 podcasts, and fortunately they put out new content every week. So I don't feel like a podcast person, but here I am.
You are,
but 26%.
You are.
Weekly.
You are a podcast person. A third of Americans listens to podcasts regularly, and so it definitely has exploded in terms of the number of podcasts that are available. So obviously, just like when YouTube exploded, just like when any of these things exploded, it's much more competitive. It's a lot harder to have a big podcast. But this is not bad news for you as a church. This is good news for you, because your goal, and again, we're going to talk more about this in a little bit, but you're not trying, or you shouldn't be trying, to start some big national brand podcast. That's not what you're trying to accomplish. And for what it's worth, that's not what we're trying to accomplish either. Like that's not our focus. Since your goal isn't, I'm going to become the next Joe Rogan or whatever, that's good news. If you can align what it is you're trying to do, it doesn't matter how crowded the space becomes, you can be successful at what it is that you are trying to accomplish. So with that being said, we got 5 steps for starting a church podcast, and we can dive in now.
Yep. So step 1, think about what your format is going to be. In general, don't just hit record one day and see what comes out of your mouth. Is it going to be varying topics? It's a broad thing, but is it going to be a topical podcast where you're just hitting things, maybe, that would coincide if you're more topical preaching, then similar things that you might preach about would be great podcast topics as well. If you're wanting to go just more into like a sermon deep dive, you could do that. If you want to interview people or tell stories, or, I think this is kind of an interesting one here, Scott, is to have more of a local focus. So I think for a church or a pastor or a church leadership team to be podcasting about their local community, I think that would be a really interesting take on, the church perspective on what's happening locally, and how the church maybe responds to those things or services that the church provides. So this is obviously not a comprehensive list. There's a lot of different angles you could take. But think through this on the front end so that you can have some consistency. I don't know if if you know any statistics on this, Scott, but of maybe listenership that becomes more loyal because of a predictable format.
Yeah, I don't know. I think you definitely need to be willing to evaluate that. That's something that we do a lot. This really, what you're hearing right now, this is our typical format. We pick a topic, and then we do the work on the front end of saying, okay, we're going to have these 5 points. Today we're doing these 5 steps, but we have a predictable format. And I think that helps, I do think, bring some loyalty, but you got to be willing to evaluate that sometimes and go, well, should we change this up? So, topical. Yeah, I like that as an option. I know a number of churches, or I've seen a couple of churches do a podcast where the pastor is able to go kind of talk about what's on the cutting room floor of the sermon. You only have 35 minutes, but you've got hours and hours of research in the thing. And so you're able to maybe talk about some maybe more complex or nuanced aspect of something that was in the text that it just didn't make sense to shoehorn it into the message. That local focus. If you have a desire in this podcast to be reaching your community, if you live in a place that no one is podcasting about your community, that would certainly open you up to a broader audience of people who are interested in what's happening in your town or your city or your neighborhood or whatever. And having that kind of a podcast might make people more aware of you.
Yeah. The world is your oyster in podcasting. So,
but pick something.
Yeah.
And stick with it for a while. I'm not saying you can't change things up at some point, but whatever you pick, kind of stick with it for a while.
Yeah. Because and we've done some interviews from time to time. We haven't done a lot. This is, I don't know, what episode are we on today? 160. We've maybe done 10 interviews in 160 podcasts, but mix it up every now and then when there's something that's just a good fit. Right. All right. So that was step 1, choosing a format. Think about this on the front end, talk to some folks, see what they think would be the best way for your church to go, and make a plan that way. Step 2, talk about and consider what your posting frequency will be. Scott and I can tell you that a weekly podcast is not an easy schedule to keep. and you probably don't have or feel like you've got a lot of extra time. So be careful what you decide to commit to. And because you do want to be consistent with it. I mean, when people have given you the nod of a clicking subscribe, then you want to be able to deliver on that. So we committed to a weekly podcast when did we start this, Scott? 2020 or 19?
2019.
Yeah. We were like, hey, well, let's do a podcast. Let's do it weekly. And wow, we've only missed a few weeks in the last 3 years that we've decided like we're not going to do an episode this week. So
yeah,
but that's a challenge.
It is a challenge. I mean, it's definitely doable, but it's a commitment. And so here are a couple ways to navigate that. One is record a bunch of them at once, and that makes it easier. You just peek behind the curtain. We're doing that right now. If you're watching the video version of the podcast, you'll notice that episode 159 and episode 160, AJ and I are wearing the same t-shirts in those episodes. But we've actually recorded a number of podcasts in a pretty short period of time over the span of a week or so, because AJ is going to be traveling for a zillion weeks. And so we needed to get a bunch recorded. So that makes it a little bit easier, but that makes it hard for a little short season to get them all. It will be nice for several weeks. We won't have any of this to do. Another way to navigate that is to just commit to doing it monthly. Maybe it's not going to be a weekly podcast. Another way to get around this, AJ, is to do seasons. So where you can go, we're doing a season, say on marriage, or you can maybe do it around whatever your sermon series is or something like that. And you have a weekly podcast for that. And then you can take a break and you have an excuse for that and go, all right, we're going to take a few weeks off. And then now you start the next season of the podcast or the next series that you're doing and kind of do a stint. So that gives you some built-in breaks that don't destroy listener loyalty. But in terms of statistics, AJ, did you know on Anchor is one of the most popular podcast platforms. It's not the one that we use, but it's a popular one. According to them, 43% of Anchor's podcasts have only one episode. And
really?
Yeah.
People burned out fast.
Really fast.
That was some impulse podcast creation there. Like, I think I'll start a podcast this week. This is going to be great. And then they never came back.
So at the end of 2021, Apple hosted 2,395,995 podcasts. But out of that, AJ, 77.2% of those podcasts are inactive. Only 22%, almost 23% are active podcasts. So,
man, out of 2 million, wow, out of like 500,000 active podcasts.
Correct. Yeah. 548,447 of those podcasts release new episodes on a regular basis.
Okay.
So, if you're going to do it, commit to doing it. So if you're going to do it, commit to a schedule that you can feel good about. This is not something you should jump into on a whim. I will say we kind of did. We kind of hopped into it.
We sometimes make decisions fairly quickly. We're like, if we both think it's a great idea at the same time, it's probably going to get started.
Yeah, I think it was one of my harebrained ideas. What if we start a podcast? I think it was hey, what if we start a podcast? Hear me out. And then you were like, yeah, okay. And then so that's essentially how the decision got made. But we've stuck with it. And largely that's because of you guys listening every week. And it's grown every year. And we get so much good feedback from you guys about how helpful the podcast is. And so so I guess I'm saying do as I say, not as I do. If you're going to do this, be intentional about it and be thoughtful about doing it, because once you get into it, you really do need to commit. You need to commit. In that sense, do as I do.
part of the decision on your posting frequency also will bleed into our step 3, and that is set the right goals. So, and these kind of break down, we've got kind of 3 things listed here: search engine optimization, awareness of your church, like building awareness of your church or ministries of your church, and a third point of just providing value. So if the goal of the podcast is just to provide value, you just want to give good information to people, there's kind of less at stake there to some extent. It's on you to create good content. But if all you care about is, you know what, I feel like this is good information and I would just love to have it out there, that really relieves some pressure from you, and a lot of details. If you want to be able to drive web traffic over to your church website, maybe for sign up forms for ministry events that are happening, different things. If you want to optimize for Google searching particular terms so that people find you because you have services to provide, that adds a whole other layer of complexity that has to be considered. In what my segue was here, if you're posting weekly and creating content around these things, you're going to probably have higher success if your goal is that awareness and search engine optimization, because the internet loves content. So your weekly podcast with show notes and all that is probably going to help you if your goals are more on SEO and awareness. And you could relax a little bit on your frequency if you just want to provide nice information.
I guess I have a slightly different feeling on the idea of just providing value. I don't see that to me as a maybe a replacement for the more concrete goals.
Sure, that's fair. Yeah, that's fair. Yeah,
but as a counterbalance to it, because if you just care like how many downloads did we get this month, and how many people did this drive to the website, and did this drive any foot traffic into the church, like if you don't want to get into that game, because for some of us, that we start to just tie our worth to that and to what those numbers are, and wanting to be sure that that downloads line is always up and to the right, and when inevitably things are going to happen that are outside of your control, or there's just a drop off in listenership in the summer or whatever. And I'm not saying you should ignore those things. You should pay attention, because it might be a signal that the podcast isn't working, or you need to change up the format, or investigate what topics are we putting out. These are things that we do on a regular basis. But at the same time, you have to recognize that your audience isn't the hundreds or thousands of people who are downloading your podcast, or when you're first starting out, probably the handful or dozens of people who are listening to your podcast. It's the person. It is the listener. When someone is listening to the podcast, you right now who's listening to this, you are not in your car with the hundreds of other people who are listening to this. You're just you. And so, what's always important to me, and when we put this podcast together, is I'm just trying to think about you sitting in your car driving to pick up your kids from school, thinking about, should our church start a podcast? So I guess to me, AJ, I don't see these things as either or, but as counterbalances to one another. You should have SEO goals, and you should have podcast downloads goals, and you should have all of those things are good. You should be paying attention to those statistics, because they can inform how you behave. But have that counterbalance of going, my goal is to provide real value to the listener. And if it serves one pastor, for us, if this podcast serves one pastor and makes them better at what they do, then it's worth all the work. So.
Yeah. That's totally fair. Totally fair.
And you shouldn't, by the way, have in your brain, I'm going to start the next Craig Groeschel leadership podcast. The number of people who peek into that, trending charts and all those things. That number is like teeny tiny. And we have a very loyal and growing podcast base, AJ, but even we're not charting in the Christianity charts or something like that. Like, it's hard to do that. Like, it's very difficult. So if you set that goal for yourself, I'm not telling you it's impossible. I'm just saying you should adjust, you should calibrate your goals according to what's realistic, and not lose sight of providing value to the individual listener.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So hit that subscribe button now and help us
Smash that! Smash that! Crush that like button! Give us a 5-star rating.
Number one. No.
That's
Step
right. Yeah.
4, get good equipment. Get some good equipment. So, all right, here's the fundamentals of podcasts, right? Microphone, yes, check. Okay. Spend a little cash on the microphone. Because you don't want to listen to a bad sounding podcast. You know, don't record it in your bathroom with your earbuds that came with your phone. It's not going to sound good. And we've done a couple of upgrades on microphones. So hopefully what you're hearing today is pretty good. Shout out to the old Blue brand. I'm talking to you on the Blue Yeti. Scott's has a different. What are you talking on, Scott? It's a little bit older, but it's a high quality mic.
Yeah. I mean, this is like a legit microphone that's connected to like a preamp thing that connects to my computer. So it's an AKG Perception 200. Yeah. I don't even know if they make these anymore. It's a little older, as you said, but it's a good.
It's definitely more complex because it's like an actual audio mic that runs through audio equipment that your church may already have. Maybe it doesn't. So
yeah. Don't be afraid to spend some money on a good microphone. I think you're not going to get anything decent for under a couple $100. I'm just being honest.
Yeah.
You're going to have to probably spend at least $200, maybe as much as $500 on something. At $500, you can get a very good microphone. You could be getting one of those like fancy Shure ones. But I mean, expect to spend somewhere between $200 and $500 on a decent microphone. Your mileage may vary depending on what kind of deal you can find on Amazon, and however inflation is treating you that day.
True. All right. We video ours. So maybe you're watching this on YouTube right now and seeing our smiling faces. Or maybe you're just listening. But so we film. And again, we've done a couple of upgrades on this. So we're running some Canon EOS M50 cameras now that you're watching us if you're on YouTube. That is helpful when you have, depending on your platform, because of internet bandwidth, things like that. So your Scott probably looks sharper and clearer to you than I do because my internet's not that good. Got great equipment, but that's another limitation. We'll talk about that in a second. So yeah, decide, do I want to video my podcast or not? I don't know if there's any stats on that, how many podcasts also get videoed or not, Scott.
I don't have a statistic on that. For us, we're right now, at least we're recording this on Zoom. It doesn't give us the highest quality audio or the highest quality video. That is something that we are in the neighborhood of upgrading at some point. But that requires bandwidth, which sadly AJ struggles with bandwidth. So
I'm challenged.
Bandwidth challenged. So we're recording on Zoom, but we figured we're recording on Zoom anyway. So there's video with it. Why not just post it? So we're not doing a lot in terms of editing the video. Again, that's something that we would like to do better with in the future. That's one of our goals. But right now we pretty much just edit the Zoom content and post it on YouTube. And for us, it's been valuable. So we don't have tons and tons and tons of the vast majority of our audience is the audio podcast audience. But we do have some folks who I think like YouTube and find us that way. And so it's just an easy thing for us to do. And to be honest with you, I think churches are set up better for this even than we are, because you're probably live streaming your services right now. So you probably have some PTZ cameras or some other kind of equipment that you already have set up that you use on Sunday. And you could very well record your podcast on your stage or someplace like that, kind of tighten that shot in on like a little table. If you're doing an interview type format, kind of make yourself a little studio looking type thing, leverage your PTZ cameras and record the same way you do record the sermon. So you may already have a fair bit of equipment that you can use on hand.
Yeah, so editing software, we've just touched into that. There's a ton of stuff out there, but there are a few standards, I suppose. And if you're in the Adobe sphere, then you've got great options there for editing. You Mac folks, I mean, there's basic Mac software that you could pull off some of these things, and then a million others, depending on your price point.
Right. I would just kind of a side note here. So what we do, we use Premiere Pro to edit what I do is we edit the video version of the podcast, and then I can export out of Premiere Pro. I can export the video file that goes to YouTube, and I can export just the audio as an MP3. So I edit the thing one time, and then I can export both formats out of one. So I like that a lot. The Adobe Creative Suite's not very expensive. I think relatively speaking, especially if you have your 501c3 stuff in hand and can get the deal through TechSoup. If you're like, what is that? Just Google it. You can get a discount on the Adobe Suite if you are registered with TechSoup and have your nonprofit stuff. So that's what we use. You're also going to need to pick a podcast hosting platform. We use Libsyn. We chose it because we liked the depth of statistics that we get out of Libsyn. A lot of the other podcasting platforms like Anchor and some others they're pretty limited in terms of the statistics that you're getting. So if you want to get good stats, then you might want to pay up a little bit. AJ, what do we pay for Libsyn? Is it like $50 a month, $20 a month?
I don't.
So we use Libsyn, which is Libsyn. AJ is $15 a month. You're right.
Okay.
And $15 a month. But we have but Anchor is out there. Anchor is free. I think there's Podbean or something like that. I think is another one. Or Buzzsprout. Buzzsprout is one. So there's a lot of options out there. Just research your choices, and they're all about the same, to tell you the truth.
Let me just point out, we have an added layer of complexity because we are two people hosting a podcast that live in two different states. So if you are doing a solo podcast, it's going to be way easier for you, and you're going to have high quality results with some decent equipment. The whole internet comes into play for us because Scott's in Tennessee and I'm in Texas, and you got to have the old internet working well for that. So your mileage probably will vary unless for some reason you choose a co-host that doesn't live anywhere near you.
That's a good point. Yeah, your bandwidth won't be necessary for that. Last point when it comes to equipment is I would say outsource. Whatever you can outsource, do it. And it's not very expensive, relatively speaking. So if you make this a priority and say, we want to do this, then be willing to put the money into it. So for us, we have a marketing person who helps just by she actually uploads the episode into Libsyn. She uploads everything into YouTube for us. She makes the graphics that go along with the podcast. She uploads the show notes. We create the content, but then from there, she takes it and does everything with it. So that really, really helps us out, even though it's not a ton of hours every week. It's like, couldn't you do that yourself? Yeah, of course we could, but we have to squeeze in those administrative tasks alongside everything else that we're trying to do. And so it's not the best investment of our time, relatively speaking. It's not, a soul crushing investment. It costs us money, but it's not a soul crushing investment. And it definitely brings a lot of value to us because we'd have to be doing it otherwise. You may already have people on staff who can add this to their bucket. And you can put that on them without it costing you anything. But you may not have someone on staff who's good at editing or something like that. So you can outsource editing a podcast and get really good quality. We did that for a little while. I think it ended up costing us about $100 an episode. So we ended up not wanting to spend the money on the editing side. I edit the podcast. We wanted to spend the money on the marketing side because I didn't want to spend my time doing that. So you just decide where you want to spend money or if you need to at all. And but don't be afraid to outsource, because it does make it easier, AJ, to stay committed to doing it if you have someone that's helping you with certain things.
Yeah. Yeah. We just have a really great weekly system and flow now, so it makes it pretty simple. Okay, step 5. So you've done a lot of setup decision making. You've decided on your format. You've decided what your posting frequency is going to be. You've thought about what the goals truly are going to be. You've bought some equipment and you're ready to launch and promote your new podcast. Well, first of all, I guess conventional wisdom has been have multiple episodes before you throw this thing out there. So get a few under your belt. There's a couple of great reasons for this. Number one, it's going to give you some practice. So your first one won't be as good as your third one, and hopefully you'll improve every week or month whenever you record. So you can sort of get a little bit better. But then also, that first person that was like, oh, wow, Pastor Charlie here's got a podcast. They can listen to that first episode, and because they're going to love it, they're going to want to hear some more. And you've got a few right there for them to click next, and check out more. And then they'll be excited for whenever your next release date's going to be. So I guess that's the idea behind having a few episodes ready to go.
Yeah, it is nice because it does already help the podcast look like this isn't one of those whatever the percentage was.
Yeah, the high percentage
that only has one episode. Yeah. It creates just a little bit of like confidence that there's going to be more of this. When you show up there for the first time, there's already 3 episodes. So, excuse me, when we launched this podcast, we launched with 3 episodes. And I think that really helped. Next on this, I want to say, just because you build it doesn't mean they'll come. I mean, there are hundreds of podcasts that get launched every week, and a lot of them don't get any listeners. So if you're going to launch a podcast, you're going to have to promote it. You're going to have to let people know that the thing exists and send people there.
Yeah. Yeah. And so then, that's also another area that you may want to spend 0 money on. Or maybe you're going to have a small budget for promotion and things like that. Again, we're talking church podcast. So, it's super easy and free, obviously, to market that to your church. If you have an email list, or, you could talk about it or put it in a bulletin or something like that. Put it on your church Facebook page. None of that costs anything to do. And so,
you have a built-in audience.
Yeah.
I mean, you have a leg up on any other random podcaster who's just starting out, who doesn't have an audience. You have people who are already like, they already listen to you every week, live and in person, hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
I suppose you're also exposing yourself into a space that might be disappointing. You're like, all right, we got 200 people at church every week, and you launch a podcast, and you get
5 listens.
5 listens, yeah, or 50 the first week and 15 the second week. So be prepared. Make sure that you're mentally stable before launching a podcast in your church.
Don't root your whole identity in this podcast. Yeah. I've joked about this on the podcast before, but my kids know that we make this podcast. And so my kids asked me a few weeks ago, Dad, are you famous? And I just laughed. I just laughed and laughed and laughed. And they said, but you're on the internet. You're on a podcast. You must be famous. And I said, I'll let them think that.
It's so funny what an elementary school kid's perception of podcasting is. That's interesting. At that age, they're aware of podcasts and think if you could be on one, you have a level of fame to it. So
they have no concept that just anybody can start one. So, but you need to promote it on social media. If you send out an email each week, if you're posting every week, this is what we do. We link the podcast in the email that we send out every week. You might be listening to this because you got an email about it. I would say that our weekly email, AJ, is probably the thing that drives consistent listenership the most.
Yeah.
And again, you're listening to this maybe because you found it, or maybe because you got an email about it. And people get our email and they look at what the topic is, and maybe they like the idea, maybe they like the topic, maybe they don't. And so on the weeks that they go, oh yeah, that sounds interesting, they click on it and they listen. And that's different people have different interests. So same is going to be true for your church. You're going to send out if you just put it in the email every week. Excuse me. And we've recorded too many podcasts in the last week. I'm losing my voice. Put it in the email each week, and yeah, maybe all 200 people who show up at your church aren't going to listen, but different people will listen each week as you touch on things that are impactful to them and their situation.
Yeah. If you somehow did a search and found this episode, I'm sorry to disappoint you. No need to subscribe. It's unlikely we're going to talk about this again for a really long time.
Yeah, this is not the topic that we were talking about regularly. But
yeah.
Last thing I want to mention on this, on promoting, AJ, we've touched on this already, but there is some real synergy that you can get between the show notes and search engine optimization, and tied to that, even the Google ad grant, if you have that as a church. This is another advantage that you have as a church. If you've got your nonprofit status, your 501c3 lined up, that other folks don't have this. So you can do an episode, write an article, show notes that go along with that podcast episode, and then you can run ads, Google ads, against that article, so that when people are searching for marriage help in, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, right? They're typing in, or they're in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and they're searching for marriage help. And you've done a podcast on healthy marriages, and you have an article on that, and you are talking about the marriage class that you have at your church, and you run an ad against that. Now, when someone's searching for marriage help in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, that's where your church is. Now you can show up, and you have not just like a link to an event, that you have a link to valuable content that they can feel like they're building a relationship with you, and they can feel like you really helped them, and then maybe they would want to show up at your class or whatever. Does that make sense? I mean, this is how having a podcast can help you actually make real life connections with real life people in your community. So I know synergy is a word that people get annoyed with, but if you're intentional with this, you can create some real synergy between your show notes, the Google ads you're running against this, the podcast content, your sermon series. Like, you can really create some tight ecosystems of content that hit different people in different ways.
Yeah. If you're gonna get traffic over to your church website, that's a whole topic for another day. But having a church website that's ready to receive guest traffic, just like your church would be if somebody walked in on a Sunday morning. So help them to find, once they're going to hit there based on whatever content they were looking for related to your podcast. But have your church website be set up then to, make it easy for them to see who is this and what are they all about. And for them to get connected to you. Ultimately, we want to connect people to Jesus, and so you want your website to be a tool to do that, and the content that you're putting out to move people in that relational direction.
Yeah, I want to maybe just put a bow on this by saying it this way. In a world where most people's pastor is Google, you need to be posting content that addresses people's real needs. And a podcast is an excellent vehicle for fueling that content creation and the posting of it. So it is a lot of work. Writing an article every week is no joke. It's a lot of work. Sitting here and recording a podcast and editing it, and then having someone who posts it. I mean, it's a whole thing. But when you're talking about the gospel, and when you're talking about reaching people in your community, and when you're talking about a world where people go to Google first when they have a problem, you need to be there. They are not going to just pop into your church when they have a problem. They're going to pop online, and you need to be there. So I really believe starting a church podcast is a great idea, because it gives you an opportunity to be in the place where people are looking for answers. So for that reason alone, you should start a church podcast.
Yeah, there you go. That's a great reason to do it. This has been episode 160 of the Church Revitalization Podcast. We're glad you were here checking this out today. Thanks for being with us. Head on over to malphursgroup.com/160 for today's show notes, as we talked about with the information that you heard Scott and I talking about today. We will see you back next week. We're looking forward to having you.